Donald Trump has pledged to escalate the economic pressure on Iran by blocking the Strait of Hormuz himself. Viktor Orban has been trounced in Hungary's general election, and Tucker Carlson clashes with the BBC's Victoria Derbyshire. I'm Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by Barry Malone. Barry, how's it going?
Stephen Methven. It's only my second time on with you, so I'm really happy about that.
I'm very happy about it. I think it's our first time in person.
It is, yes.
Very nice.
Which is great.
Good. Yeah. If you'd like to support our work, remember that you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also, of course, listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments below as well, as always. Ceasefire talks between Iran and the US took place in Islamabad, Pakistan this weekend, with no deal reached after 21 hours of negotiations between the two teams. And in response, US President Donald Trump pledged to escalate the economic pressure on Iran. In a Truth Social post, Trump wrote this: Iran promised to open the Strait of Hormuz, and they knowingly failed to do so. This caused anxiety, dislocation, and pain to many people and countries throughout the world. They say they put mines in the water, even though all of their navy and most of their mine droppers have been completely blown up. They may have done so, but what ship owner would want to take the chance? There is great dishonor and permanent harm to the reputation of Iran and what's left of their leaders. But we are beyond all of that. As they promised, they better begin the process of getting this international waterway open and fast. Every law in the book is being violated by them. Then, in another post, Trump went on to say this: effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. At some point, we will reach an all being allowed to go in, all being allowed to go out basis. But Iran has not allowed that to happen by merely saying there may be a mine out there somewhere that nobody knows about but them. This is world extortion, and leaders of countries, especially the United States of America, will never be extorted. I've also instructed our Navy to seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran. No one who pays an illegal toll will have safe passage on the high seas. We will also begin destroying the mines the Iranians laid in the straits. Any Iranian who fires at us or at peaceful vessels will be blown to hell. So really interesting there that in one post, Trump is very clear that blockading the strait is illegal. And then in another post, he's very clear that that's exactly what he's going to do as well. As though, look, I know that international law is really just a kind of protection racket for the powerful and its allies. But you don't normally see it sort of spelled out so brazenly. When Iran does it, it's completely wrong, breaking every law in the book. But I'm going to do it, and that's going to be fine because somehow my illegal action will be tackling another illegal action, and that by a strange arithmetic of the law will make it legal. This morning, US Central Command confirmed that a US blockade would go ahead, and indeed it has now gone ahead, though on less dramatic terms than indicated by Trump, saying this: US Central Command, CENTCOM forces, will begin implementing a blockade of all maritime traffic entering and exiting Iranian ports on April the 13th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, in accordance with the President's proclamation. The blockade will be enforced impartially against vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. CENTCOM forces will not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports. So I read somewhere that actually in a time of war, this could potentially be legal. The idea that there's an enemy and you're using your Navy to inspect what is transiting in and out of those enemy ports. Of course, what Donald Trump denies is that this is a time of war, because in order for it to be a time of war, he would have had to have congressional approval to launch this illegal attack on Iran. But perhaps these are niceties that nobody really cares about anymore. So the blockade appears to be aimed primarily at Iranian oil shipments. Throughout the war, the US has been allowing some Iranian oil tankers to pass from its ports and through Hormuz, a fact confirmed by US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent last month. But why? Well, Bessent said it was to ease pressure on the international oil supply following Iran's closure of the strait. Now, look, I'm not a military or political strategist, obviously, but it isn't clear to me that blocking Iranian ships is going to cause them to reopen that strait anytime soon. And while, sure, it will put a degree of economic pressure on Iran, the pressure on the wider world is surely going to continue to grow as Hormuz remains closed. And now it will potentially grow even faster with Iranian barrels now also being blocked from entering the markets. That at least seemed to be what Iranian parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf was suggesting when he posted this formula, apparently showing that the negative impact of a non-zero uptick in oil prices resulting from a US blockade would be exponential. Ghalibaf provided no proof, and he assumes that the negative impact would only be felt outside of Iran. That's why it's sort of posed as a threat to US gas prices. But others disagree. This was US diplomat Dennis Ross's assessment. The blockade always made more sense than seizing Hague Island. It stops Iran's exports, its revenues, it's a counterpoint to their closing the straits. They may attack Gulf oil facilities, but it puts greater pressure on Iran. It also puts greater pressure on China to pressure Iran into opening the straits, presumably. China, Iran's largest oil customer, has so far only responded diplomatically. The country has urged restraint in response to Trump's threat, describing the ongoing war as the root cause of the crisis. The markets have also anticipated increased disruption. Oil once again topped $100 a barrel as markets opened this morning, with Brent crude seeing a 7% increase in price. Liquid natural gas prices rose by 9%. Barry, we'll come on to the details of the negotiations that took place over the weekend in a moment. But what do you make of this new move by Trump, the suggestion that he will tackle a blockade with a blockade? Do you think, what kind of impact do you think that's going to have on Iran, on the wider world, and will it work?
I think, I'm sorry, I don't know how else to slice this. I think it's a really stupid move, an incredibly stupid move strategically. And the main impact that it's going to have is exactly on the wider world. The impact that it's going to have on the wider world is much greater than the impact it's going to have on Iran, whether that's economically or in terms of putting on political pressure. The pressure is going to come on Trump for making it potentially worse. You know, I think that there was a sense when Iran closed the straits initially that the world would blame Iran for that. It's not blaming Iran for that. The world is blaming Donald Trump for that. Even at home, even his MAGA base are blaming him for the coming economic storm. The war is incredibly unpopular at home. It's incredibly unpopular with its base. It's incredibly unpopular in Europe. We're starting to see other world leaders, you know, become slightly bolder in pulling away from him and in standing up to him, slightly bolder from a very low base. And even we're starting to see some right-wing parties in places like Europe pulling away. And the impact that we're talking about is huge. I think that I said on the show last week that we've almost been in kind of a lull to some extent in terms of this impact, because it's not like you open the straits tomorrow and everything goes right back to normal. There's a massive backlog of ships that still haven't passed through. I think the last I checked, there were 187 super tankers waiting in the Gulf to pass through. They're carrying 170 million barrels of crude. Production has also stopped. They're down like 11.5 million barrels a day of production in the Gulf. I think the other thing I said last week is that there were still tankers traversing the globe, right? So they move at the speed of a bicycle, I learned. And that means that they were still traveling, you know, weeks after the war began. And I think the last tankers that were on their way to the US, for example, are due to arrive in a couple of days. However, we already are seeing a massive impact. I think I reeled off a list before. There's South Africa, Pakistan, Vietnam, the Philippines. We're seeing government offices closed. We're seeing schools closed. Last week, we've had field protests in Ireland, which turned very extreme. Now, they were kind of hijacked by the far right. That's another story. But there were a lot of people involved in those protests who had genuine concerns, hauliers and farmers, etc. So we're starting to see it bite. And then just, you know, move away from that economic impact for a second and think about Trump himself and think about the Republicans and think about the impact that it's going to have on them if by closing the strait, extra closing the strait, double closing the strait, politically that's suicide for them. Again, you know, I've said it on this show many, many times, the midterms are coming up. It's not looking good for Trump in the midterms. The longer this goes on, the less good it looks for him in the midterms. So in terms of quote unquote winning the war, in terms of improving his popularity at home, in terms of easing up pressure on the global economy, bad.
Well, for sure. But I mean, let me play devil's advocate for a moment, because I guess there's there's no doubt that this is going to cause increased pain in terms of oil prices. But a lot of that oil that would have been transiting from Iran out of the Strait isn't going to be aimed at the kind of markets that you've been talking about. It's mostly be going to China, right? Potentially. Maybe a few other places as well.
The oil from Iran, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But not the oil from the Gulf.
No, the Gulf is going everywhere, sure. But just this additional blockade that Trump has put on is not going to affect supply, it will affect price. So then it's a question of who can bear the pain for longest, right? So, I don't know what the kind of economic activity in Iran has been like over the course of the war. Presumably not very much, very little in terms of income generation for the country, which is also, going through all of its military stockpiles, just as the US has done. I mean, obviously Iran's not nearly as expensive, but it doesn't have nearly as much money. So I guess the question is, how much pain can Iran take versus how much pain can the world take before the world kicks off? I mean, I guess one of the features of an economic blockade, which may still be linked to, some fantasies about regime change, is that it will eventually cause economic hardship so great that the people revolt. I mean, it seems to me that doesn't really work. That economic hardship just tends to weaken people rather than build them up in a way that means that they can take on a government, for example. But I guess my question is, isn't it just a matter of who can take most pain in the short term?
Yeah, but I think Iran has already shown that it can take the pain. Iran has been under crippling Western sanctions for years and years and years, and yet the government has survived that. We know that the economy in Iran, the fact that people, many people can't put food on the table, this is one of the things that was behind the anti-government protests. It wasn't the only thing. There are other reasons that the people in Iran who stand against the government, those of them who do, have to want to heave against the government. But the economy was a big one. And, that was, like I say, to a huge extent, the result of Western sanctions. And the government showed that it could kind of ride that out. Now, this is obviously extra pressure, potentially, but this is a government that's fighting for its life. It's fighting for its survival. It is not going to bend to economic pressure. The only thing that I do think you have a point with is that it could put more pressure on them domestically, which I think is something that, particularly Israel might want to do. I think that Israel's goal, partly all along, has just been to destabilize Iran, destroy Iran, turn Iran into a failed state, leave it as a country that's going to take decades and decades to get to where it was before. So squeezing its economy, making things more difficult for the people as a method to potentially put pressure on the government domestically, and I guess they think potentially topple the government, I can see. The other thing that I can see them thinking would work, not that I necessarily think that the government can't write it out. The one thing I do think that diplomat had one good point, that the tweet that you showed, where he said that there is the China element there. I think China has been playing a waiting game, and they've been happy to just sort of sit back and watch this play out. They do have the ability to put some pressure on Iran, but again, they're going to have to be China is going to have to be in a really difficult position before it does that. So I guess my punt is Iran's going to ride it out.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't want to imply that there weren't sort of political risks for the US in doing this as well. I mean, Iran has so far used sort of small, agile boats to, make kind of hurried attacks on vessels who've tried to get through the strait. There's potentially mines. Nobody seems to really know for sure. But the US is going to be messing about with bits of equipment, ships worth hundreds of billions of dollars, right? That's what they're going to be taking in there to do the second blockade on the blockade. There are risks attached to that, right? There's a blast on one of those incredibly expensive bits of kit, the loss of a serviceman, or the injury even. These are all like politically damaging potential events for Trump. When, as you say, the American US population doesn't really understand what they're doing there in the first place. So, do you think that there's a bit of a kind of sunk cost fallacy going on here with the Americans? I mean, the thing to remember, of course, we're still, although the negotiations took place this weekend, we are still in negotiations, right? There's another 9 days left of the ceasefire. They'll very likely, I'd have thought, meet again. So a lot of this, I guess, could be posturing. But if it isn't, there are risks for the US as well in trying to do this blockade. like domestic risks?
I think you're right when you say sunken cost fallacy. I think we've gotten to a stage now where the US and Trump are desperately trying to save face. They're desperately trying to save face with these negotiations. They want to be able to come out and say, we achieved something. We achieved this, this, and this. And they want to be able to bring that to the American public. Because as you said, right now, they're not articulating any real strategic reason, certainly that the American public understand right now. We're seeing that the American public, again, including the MAGA base, because invading Iran or toppling the Iranian government, was never a MAGA project. Quite the opposite. America First was the MAGA project, right? And I was talking to one US analyst who said, the longer this goes on, the worse it is for Trump. He needs to get out quick, because we get into next month, we get into the next month after. That's when midterms campaigning is super, super underway. All the maths show that right now, the Republicans will lose the House. Senate, really, really hard to flip seats in the Senate, but people are even saying that that's in play. So what we could be left with is a lame duck presidency, and Trump will egg all over his face. I do think there's a bit of sunken cost fallacy here, and I do think there's a sort of a face-saving effort here. And politically, domestically, the best thing for Trump to do probably will be to end this right now.
Potentially more than just a lame duck, right? He might be sort of snarled up in impeachment attempts, come the midterms.
That's if they flip the House, that's the first thing they're going to do.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go on to those negotiations that took place over the weekend. We know that they didn't result in a deal, but what's less clear is where exactly the sticking points lay. This was US Vice President J.D. Vance speaking after the deal making came to an end.
The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement. And I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could. And they have chosen not to accept our terms.
So what were those red lines? Well, Vance went into a little bit of detail.
Well, I won't go into all the details because I don't want to negotiate in public after we negotiated for 21 hours in private. But the simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations. Again, their nuclear program, such as it is, the enrichment facilities that they had before, they've been destroyed. But the simple question is, do we see a fundamental commitment of will for the Iranians not to develop a nuclear weapon, not just now, not just 2 years from now, but for the long term? We haven't seen that yet. We hope that we will.
So according to Vance, it wasn't just Iran's current nuclear capabilities, but any capacity to enrich uranium that was a US red line. Now, Iran has always denied seeking to produce nuclear weapons. Not everyone has believed them all the time, but they've always denied it. And while it has 660 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, nuclear experts have repeatedly stressed that 90% is needed for an effective weapon. And that's only the beginning. You also then need to build a delivery system and pack it explosively, et cetera. It's not a quick process. According to Trump in June last year, that was rendered impossible, the enrichment to 90%, by his last bombing campaign in the country.
Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
It doesn't really sound like they've been completely and totally obliterated if you're worried about them continuing to enrich uranium. And in fact, we now know that they haven't been completely and totally obliterated. Iran has in the past also made other offers to placate those concerned about the uranium stockpiles it's still said to have. Just 3 weeks before the US and Israel launched their illegal war on the country, Iran offered to dilute its 60% enriched uranium in exchange for sanctions relief. But the country has always held that it has the right to enrich uranium on its own territory under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it's a signatory of. One state that's always rejected that is Israel. In early February, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that, quote, all enriched material has to leave Iran and that there should be no enrichment capability. And those comments, by the way, were made just days after a meeting between Netanyahu and Trump in which the war was kind of agreed, which was the subject of a really, really interesting New York Times piece that was published last year. So on this point, Israel and the US appear to be on the same page now. And perhaps it was that expansion of the US's demand that led Iran's foreign minister and ceasefire negotiator, Saeed Abbas Araghchi, to say this about the talks. In intensive talks at highest level in 47 years, Iran engaged with the US in good faith to end war. But when just inches away from Islamabad MOU, we encountered maximalism, shifting goalposts, and blockade. Zero lessons learned, I think he means. Goodwill begets goodwill. Enmity begets enmity. Now, there have been some other insider details about what might have been on offer from the US. David Ignatius writes this in the Washington Post about intel he says he's gleaned from sources close to the negotiations. With the Iranian regime still standing after weeks of intense bombardment and still holding major cards in the remnants of its nuclear program and its ability to disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, Trump decided to propose what he might call a Tiffany deal, a big glittering package of economic benefits, including removal of economic sanctions, in exchange for a full renunciation of Iran's nuclear and missile programs and support for proxies. Trump administration officials see three possible scenarios as the US tightens its economic grip. First, the regime could be overthrown, an outcome they think is more likely to occur once the bombing has stopped than before. Second, Galibaf or some other new leader could decide to cross what the Trump team has pitched as a golden bridge into a new future. Or third, hardliners in the IRGC could try to break the blockade or launch other strikes to force more US concessions. If a still emboldened Iran tries to press what it sees as its advantages through military or terrorist attacks, Trump could be forced into the escalating military confrontation he hopes to avoid. That's the risk of the strategy the Trump team adopted in Islamabad. They showed how much the US is willing to offer to get a peace deal, but Trump doesn't negotiate by increments. He thinks small deals produce small results. That's the logic here. Make the cake bigger, even as you tighten economic pressure on Tehran to accept US terms. The aim is to convince Galibaf and his colleagues to transition from being a revolutionary cause that threatens the region into a real country that can modernize quickly and profitably, like its neighbors Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates across the Gulf. These negotiations clearly aren't over and are in many ways still going on in public now. But speaking to journalists after the negotiations concluded, Trump was careful to project a lack of interest in the question of whether he thought the Iranians would return to the table.
Oh, I don't know. I don't care if they come back or not. If they don't come back, I'm fine. Their military is gone. Their missiles are largely depleted. The manufacturing capability for missiles and drones is largely defeated. We've been very nice. We haven't ripped down too many bridges. We did one only because they broke their word. They broke their promise. And remember, their promise was that they were going to open the Hormuz Strait. They didn't do it.
Barry, what do you make of that? What do you make of that Ignatius stuff about, this is the pitch, the careful pitch the Americans are making, this Tiffany deal where they offer a lot while make it as attractive as possible while tightening the economic grip in order to get the thing that they want, which is this kind of very stark red line on uranium enrichment.
Yeah, I do. Before we go to that, I do want to just call out that Ignatius column a little bit. Because it's such a good example of sort of like Washington, D.C. galaxy brain thinking, where at the end he says Iran should transition from being a revolutionary cause into a real country.
Yeah.
What is he talking about? It should transition into a real country. And then the other bit where he says that it needs to transition from being a country that threatens the region. Notwithstanding the fact that it's Israel who's attacking almost every country in the region and committing a genocide. That's my little rant about David Ignatius. But what's interesting when you look at his sort of insider reporting is that it almost feels like a game. It feels like some sort of a game of chess that, to some extent, again, is all about saving face. Because the nuclear thing just does not wash. It does not wash at all as a reason for the US and Israel attacking Iran, certainly for the US attacking Iran. The Washington wants us to believe that Iran somehow posed an imminent threat to the US? Of course it didn't. Many people have made this point, but Iran has supposedly been an imminent threat to the US for decades, right? But it wasn't even an quote unquote imminent threat a year ago before the 12-day war was launched. After the 12-day war, as we saw in that clip, Trump said that its nuclear capacity was completely obliterated. Now, if we want to park for a second Donald Trump and say that this is a guy who we can't believe, who talks a big game, he says one thing one day, another thing the next day, Tulsi Gabbard, just let me get her title right. She's the US Director of National Intelligence. We all know who Tulsi Gabbard is, but that is her current position. She told the Senate Intelligence Committee in March, quote, as a result of Operation Midnight Hammer, that being the 12-day war, Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated, echoing Trump's words. But this is key. There has been no effort since then to try to rebuild their enrichment capability. That's what she told the Senate Intelligence Committee. Now, I find that a lot more authoritative than something that Trump would say. And I think that is key. The nuclear thing is an absolute smokescreen. And I almost feel like they're retrofitting that. The reason that the US went to war with Iran was because Israel wanted it to go to war with Iran and because Israel wants to destroy Iran. Honestly, it's that simple. And now they're trying to retrofit all these justifications that don't hold muster.
Yeah, I think I have in mind like the very, very worst nightmare for Trump. So the way that I understand what's happened here is in 2018, Trump got bounced into tearing up the Iran nuclear deal. Then, if you read this really interesting New York Times piece, I don't know if you've read it about what the lead up to the war and the meeting with Netanyahu in early February. The nuclear isn't even mentioned there. It's regime change. It's stopping Iran from projecting power in the region. You might think maybe that includes like the potential of nuclear weapons, but it's not explicit. It's destroying the ballistic missiles program. And decapitating the leadership. The CIA then, according to this piece, assesses Netanyahu's pitch and finds it farcical, except for two bits: the possibility of decapitating the leadership and of destroying the ballistic missiles program. I think that was the other one. But like the regime change, projecting power, all seemed completely out of reach. But Trump nonetheless agreed to this adventure. And now he's in the position where he has none of the victories. And the only outcome that looks plausible from this negotiation is basically a rerun of the Obama-era nuclear deal, right? It's a case where Iran says, we won't do nuclear weapons. We never wanted to. We'll continue to enrich uranium, but we're happy to have an inspections regime, and we'll ship the byproducts off to various places as they had to do before. And that for Trump is a nightmare, because then all that's happened is he's taken everything back to the status quo ante of 2017, 2018. But in the meantime, he's spent $2 billion a day fighting this war. So roughly $80 billion so far, $200 billion more requested, 15 soldiers or service people dead, hundreds injured, and a disastrous midterms ahead. The MAGA coalition sort of fracturing over this broken promise to not do any more wars. That to me looks like the nightmare scenario for Trump, which is no one is discussing. Everyone's discussing the nightmare scenario for Iran or what they'll have to concede. But actually, that seems to me that a position that Trump cannot accept, where he just goes back to anything that looks like the Obama deal. So that means that enrichment has to be the red line. But Iran seems so much sort of in some way, I mean, I know it's been, brutalized and decimated and bombed, but, it now knows something that it didn't know before, which is that it can switch the Strait of Hormuz on and off as it likes with very little cost to itself. So it has that, and it has, on the uranium line of enrichment, I mean, what are they going to do? Is Trump going to go back to war if they refuse? I mean, it just seems like the negotiations can't really go anywhere unless that comes off the table.
Hey, it's like, Trump is now faced with this massive challenge to put things back as they were, right? And the JCPOA, by the way, was a pretty good deal for the West. And Iran has, I think, always shown a willingness to be pragmatic around its nuclear program. I'm often saying to people, the Iranian government are rational actors. They're often depicted in the West as being these, crazy ayatollahs who, as soon as they get a nuclear bomb, they will bash the button and fire it at everybody. No, they've proven themselves to be very rational actors diplomatically. So, yes, we're looking at Trump having to undertake this incredibly difficult task to almost put things back together. And look, there have been a massive price to pay in Iran in terms of, how many political leaders have been killed, the depletion of missile stocks, and on and on and again. And, when we talk about political chess games and oil prices, we shouldn't forget 170 schoolgirls killed and lots of civilians killed. So, look, there has been a heavy price, but I think that the Iranian government will believe that if it survives and if this, if it's not toppled as the US and Israel want to do, then it has achieved a victory. And the Straits of Hormuz thing, it learning that it can do that and hold the whole world ransom. There has always been a sense going years back that Iran would never, ever, ever do that. There was a column I was reading today written by a sort of a veteran oil reporter who was recalling that back in 2012, he was at a meeting in Qatar, and the then Saudi Arabia oil minister, energy minister was there. And he said, if you think Iran is ever going to block the Strait of Hormuz, then I can sell you the Empire State Building, right? That's what he told this oil reporter, because he said it's just impossible. Because it was actually a bit like nuclear weapons. There was a belief that would mean self-assured destruction. Not self-assured, mutually assured destruction, and that is why Iran wouldn't do that. And I think, as I said earlier, the Iranian government is fighting for its life. It's realized that it has this lever that it can actually pull. And the US, if it hasn't realized, needs to realize it's in a bloody codependent relationship with Iran. That's the reality.
That's very true. Yeah. Let's go on to another bit of this story, a kind of, bonkers bit, really. US President Donald Trump loves to pick a fight, but on Monday, he attacked someone that most politicians try to keep firmly off limits. Writing on Truth Social, Trump said a lot. Pope Leo is weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy. He talks about fear of the Trump administration, but doesn't mention the fear that the Catholic Church and all other Christian organizations had during COVID, when they were arresting priests, ministers, and everybody else for holding church services, even when going outside and being 10 and even 20 feet apart. I like his brother Louis much better than I like him, because Louis is all MAGA. He gets it and Leo doesn't. I don't want a pope who thinks it's okay for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. I don't want a pope who thinks it's terrible that America attacked Venezuela, a country that was sending massive amounts of drugs into the United States, and even worse, emptying their prisons, including murderers, drug dealers, and killers, into our country. And I don't want a pope who criticizes the president of the United States because I'm doing exactly what I was elected in a landslide to do, setting record low numbers in crime and creating the greatest stock market in history. Leo should be thankful because, as everyone knows, he was a shocking surprise. He wasn't on any list to be pope and was only put there by the church because he was an American and they thought that would be the best way to deal with President Donald J. Trump. If I wasn't in the White House, Leo wouldn't be in the Vatican. Unfortunately, Leo's weak on crime, weak on nuclear weapons, does not sit well with me, nor does the fact that he meets with Obama sympathizers like David Axelrod, a loser from the left, who is one of those who wanted churchgoers and clerics to be arrested. Leo should get his act together as Pope, use common sense, stop catering to the radical left, and focus on being a great Pope, not a politician. It's hurting him very badly, and more importantly, it's hurting the Catholic Church. Now, that post came after repeated criticisms of the US-Israel war on Iran, an illegal war, let's remember, criticisms that came from the Vatican. And it came shortly after Trump posted this bit of AI slop, depicting himself as a healing Christ-like figure with public servants kneeling all around him, warplanes, an eagle, and I don't know, like the souls of recently killed soldiers ascending to heaven in the background. There's like a lot going on there. So what is it that finally triggered Trump? Perhaps it was this. On Saturday, Pope Leo held a prayer vigil in the Vatican, and during his homily, he said this: We are surrounded by a delusion of omnipotence that is becoming increasingly unpredictable and aggressive. The balance within the human family has been severely destabilized. Even the holy name of God, the God of life, is being dragged into discourses of death. That was taken to be a reference to this statement from Trump last week.
You've said glory be to God in this conflict. Do you believe that God supports the United States' actions in this
I do,
war?
because
And have you
God
sought
is
his direction?
good, because God is good, and God wants to see people taken care of. God doesn't like what's happening. I don't like what's happening. Everyone says, I don't enjoy this. I don't enjoy it. These two guys don't enjoy it. You know, people say, oh boy, they're so tough. I don't like seeing people killed.
So that was Donald Trump there, presenting himself as Christ in a bit of AI nonsense, but also just, reporting on God's views in a press conference, God's approving views, surprise, surprise, of his war on Iran. Earlier today, Pope Leo had this response to Trump's attack.
I have no fear, neither the Trump administration nor speaking out loudly about the message of the gospel. And that's what I believe I am called to do, what the church is called to do. We're not politicians. We're not looking to make foreign policy, as he calls it, with the same perspective that he might understand it. But I do believe that the message of the gospel, blessed are the peacemakers, is a message that the world needs to hear today.
Barry, when I read that post of Trump's this morning, it was maybe like the first time that I actually started to think, maybe he is losing it. Maybe like there is like something really, really up with him, because I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen, especially in the US, which is, I know it's constitutionally a secular country, but there's a lot of Christians there, and there are a lot of Catholics as well, and indeed there's a whole kind of movement of MAGA Catholicism, which you see with sort of Marco Rubio, like wearing very ostentatious Ash Wednesday crosses on the foreheads, and then J.D. Vance and others. So, yeah, what is going on here? Is it wise for Trump to be attacking the Pope? Does it make political sense?
I'm an Irish Catholic, and I've had Ash Wednesday never as massive as those guys.
Yeah, half my family's Catholic. I've never seen that
absurd before. Ash Wednesday course. Yeah, there is that. I think, from what I understand, it's not unprecedented for a US president to think that God is supporting his war. Let's remember George W. Bush and Tony Blair apparently praying together at the beginning of the Iraq war. But I believe that it is unprecedented for a US president to be involved in a war of words with a pope. I've seen that there is some analysis that is suggesting that it's actually dodgy or potentially damaging for Leo, because there are a lot of conservative Catholics who may side with Trump. Mm-hmm. But then I think also in the US domestically it is potentially damaging for Trump and that growing MAGA Catholic movement. But, for me, honestly, I felt a bit like you when I read it this morning. I thought, God, my first thought was 25th Amendment. Like people are already talking about it's not going to happen. But, is this a guy who needs to be removed from office? Because it just read completely unhinged. I do think, in a kind of a serious point, it does speak to what a sort of a small man he is in terms of how quickly riled he is by any hint of criticism and how he can react in quite an unhinged way to that criticism. And, the fear that can drive policy to some extent if he feels slighted by a figure like the Pope.
Yeah, I think it's obvious that they do care what the Pope says, because there have been reports for a while now of the Pentagon having called in the Vatican's ambassador to the US to sort of criticize, or to voice some criticisms of Leo's remarks about the war. Again, a very unprecedented move. The Pentagon denies it, but there have been many reports of that. That shows a level of care. But I think, what you say about the smallness, it's so true. It's like there's a feature of Trump's thinking about politics where it just always involves an individual that he's fighting. It's never actually about the electorate or the people. There's always an individual, a figure that he's battling against.
Even with world leaders, sometimes it goes as far as, he's a good guy. I like it.
Yeah.
But look, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan apparently got on great together and were brilliant buddies, but their policies are aligned.
Yeah.
But sometimes with Trump, and there's deep reporting to suggest this, this isn't just me speculating. This is, stuff that has surfaced from bloody solid reporting in the US to show that he can be swayed purely by personality thing with really important people, including world leaders.
Yeah. That was Hungarian orthopedic surgeon and potential future health minister Zsolt Hegedűs absolutely throwing shapes after his Tisza party stormed to election victory in Hungary on Sunday night. And Hegedűs, along with many Hungarians, had good reasons to be optimistic. The election this weekend brought to an end 16 years of rule by Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his Christian nationalist Fidesz party. Although previously an unstoppable election winner with 4 election victories, each winning his party a supermajority under his belt, Orban also restructured the Hungarian state in directions aimed at keeping him in power. The media, election laws, and the constitution were all shaped under his regime, increasingly described as autocratic or illiberal by observers, while cronyism grew rampant. And Orban himself grew increasingly close to Russian President Vladimir Putin, a fact that riled his counterparts throughout the European Union. He also aligned himself with the US MAGA movement, and they with him, drawn to his anti-migration message and insistence that Europe be for the Europeans and Hungary for the Hungarians. It's that kind of messaging that led US Vice President J.D. Vance to Hungary last week, where he campaigned for the now rejected Prime Minister.
Will you stand against the bureaucrats in Brussels? Will you stand for sovereignty and democracy? Will you stand for Western civilization? Will you stand for freedom, for truth, and for the God of our fathers? Then, my friends, go to the polls in the weekend, stand with Viktor Orban because he stands for you and he stands for all these things. God bless Hungary and God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Just like bang, 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 hitting every, right, ethno-nationalist, populist beat there. And I can't really think of a clearer example of election interference than the Vice President of the United States going to a country, campaigning for a particular leader for it. I mean, they've denied it. They've just, well, as they always do, I guess, they've just outright denied that there was any kind of electioneering going on, any kind of election interference happening there, with J.D. Vance, second most powerful person in the world, setting out his stall behind Orban the week before the election. I mean, calling for people to go and vote for him. Anyway, in the end, it was bread and butter issues that led to Orban's demise. It's the economy, stupid. Peter Magyar, the 45-year-old leader of Tisza, campaigned on issues close to voters' hearts, futures, and bank accounts. Inflation, economic stagnation, and spiraling corruption remained center stage throughout his campaign, as did nationalist imagery, Hungarian flags, occasional traditional dress, and a rejection of foreign interference from the US, Russia, and the right-wing European parties were frequent themes. It's possible that a part of Magyar's success came from the years he spent working as a member of Orban's Fidesz party, while being married to its justice secretary under Orban. In February of 2024, it emerged that Hungary's former president, Katalin Novak, had pardoned a man convicted of helping cover up a sex abuse case in a children's home. Also implicated in the pardon was Magyar's former wife, who had signed the pardon off as the justice minister. Magyar resigned from his positions on 2 state-owned companies and began vociferously calling out government corruption as a result of this case. A month later, he joined Tisza, a centre-right populist party, and in that role, he's made clear that he will take an even harder line on migration than Orban by scrapping the country's guest worker scheme, for example. For some, he's described as Orban without the corruption, though he's also promised a reset of the country's relationship with Europe and a return of democratic checks and balances. And he now has the mandate to undo a lot of Orban's work, having won 138 seats in the country's National Assembly, comfortably over the 2/3 majority required to bring in constitutional changes. Some European leaders could barely conceal their excitement at his win.
The people of Hungary have spoken and they have reclaimed their European path. It is a victory for fundamental freedoms. And I really want to say to the Hungarian people, you've done it again, against all odds. So with this result, our union is stronger. Our union is more united. It was an exceptional evening yesterday.
A lot of smirking going on there. In Budapest, some Magyar supporters gave Reuters their view of the result on Sunday night.
Fantastic! Absolutely brilliant, yeah.
Very happy.
Been waiting for this for a very long time. This will change everything in Europe, everything. This country is a fine country. It's been for 16 years almost in an autocratic regime, and it's a really big impact on Europe, the way that this Prime Minister has supported Russia and has the eyes of the US all over it. And this is a really big moment for Europe, we think. And especially for the Hungarian people. I think they have suffered too long under this government, and now it's time for a change.
Amazing! We can't describe it. We cannot describe it. We are so happy that Orban is finally gone.
Yes. We did not believe that there is a change.
We are glad to feel some sense of hope finally.
Yes!
After
We changed the system.
We changed the system.
So finally, after at least 16 years, we feel like there is a hope.
Yes.
We feel like there is a hope that Hungary can start walking into the right direction.
Certainly means though is change.
Yes.
Much needed change after 16 years of the same ruling. It's about to change now.
Barry, those were all Magyar supporters that we saw there. But presumably something of this feeling is quite widespread in the country. I mean, he just won an enormous landslide. What do you make of it? What do you think? I mean, I've got to say, Orban, to his credit, has conceded defeat. He's not sort of trying to hang on. He's not so far anyway called a corrupt election or tried to challenge it in any way. What do you think is going to happen next for Hungary?
Yeah, there were fears that he would potentially reject the result, but he conceded very fast. He conceded even before the voting or the counting was finished. I think it's a huge story. I think it's a huge story for Hungary, first and foremost. I mean, as you said, the economy was on its uppers and people were incredibly angry about that. There was a lot of corruption. There was bad governance. People rightly describe Orban as far right and running this sort of far right country, but he was also a kleptocrat. That's what the country was. It was a system of patronage, and it was people close to Orban enriching themselves, right? And I think the public had become increasingly angry about that. And I think Peter Magyar made a big issue of that when he was campaigning, and he's been talking about little else apparently for the last couple of years while he's been touring the country. So in terms of what he might do in Hungary, it's a massive story. He has said that he's going to root out corruption. He has said that he may change the constitution in order to ensure that prime ministers can only serve 2 terms. He said that he's going to reorient back towards the European Union and away from Russia, primarily, which would be very good news for the European Union. And presumably he's going to want a release of funds also in order to do that, which I guess may help with the economy. So look, big story for Hungary, big story for the European Union, because Orban has effectively been the spoiler in the EU, primarily when it comes to, first of all, he's been something of an outlier. And because of his close relationship with Putin, he's been a spoiler when it's come to things like funding the Ukraine war. I don't think Magyar is going to turn around all of a sudden and become a massive Ukraine supporter, because the Hungarian public have been massively poisoned against Ukraine over the years. And I think that's going to take some time to undo. I mean, a lot of Orban's and his party's tentacles are right across the state, right? Whether that's in the judiciary, even the anti-corruption bodies, the military, the constitutional court, the presidency. I mean, this is going to take some time to undo. Also, it's a big story for the MAGA movement, right? Because J.D. Vance went over there. blatant meddling, blatant electioneering. I read today that there was a poll done just after he came and made his big speech, which showed that Orban had dropped another 3 points. So good job, JD Vance. Well done. The US sent one of the least charismatic people it could to try and rally the troops for Orban. But I think on a serious note, what it might do is it might send a little bit of a warning shot to the populist right in Europe to say, look, cozying up to Trump may have benefited you in the past, but it might not benefit you anymore. And in fact, it might be a hindrance. I think that the war in Iran has exacerbated that thought, and I think has made Trump more of a potential hindrance to be close to for the right. I mean, even Farage here hasn't exactly come out recently and massively supported Britain getting involved in the war in Iran. So I think there is a step away from Trump. I think this will exacerbate that, and that's bad for MAGA as a sort of a global movement, right?
Yeah, the brand is toxic.
Yeah, the brand is toxic.
I really can't see Farage, wanting JD Vance, anybody from that team on the campaign trail come a general election here. It's interesting though what you say about nationalist populist parties or right populist parties. They do seem to be kind of at this. I mean, let's not over-egg it, but Law and Justice lost in Poland a couple of years ago. The Liberals, the Liberal Party, sort of got back. The EU-friendly Liberal Party got back in there again as a result of a kind of corruption, rather than the politics of Law and Justice. I mean, there were part of the politics was anti-abortion legislation, which made a lot of people very angry in Poland. But one thing that was promised that never really seemed to happen in Poland was like prosecutions of the previous corrupt officials. Do you think that's something that we'll see in Hungary, or is it politically better to turn the page and move on?
I don't know. I mean, another thing that when we're talking about Poland, I think another thing that we've seen is that Donald Tusk has really struggled to undo the sort of the deep state tentacles that I'm talking about over the last couple of years in order to make progress.
He's got a right-wing president though, right? He's still got a law and justice president.
There's also a sort of Orbanist president in Hungary, isn't there? And again, I think it just shows how difficult these things are, especially when Orban has been in for 16 years, right, running a system that to a large extent has relied on patronage. I don't know if people are going to be prosecuted. I can't speculate, but Magyar has made corruption an absolute central plank of his campaign, and he has spoken about it incessantly for the last 2 years. And up there with the economy, this is what he was elected on. That's the platform upon which he was elected. So I don't know. It would be, if he wants to follow through, he probably should.
On Saturday, the Metropolitan Police arrested over 500 people in London's Trafalgar Square. The reason? They were peacefully holding up signs bearing the message, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action." That's a message that remains illegal to publicly utter or display in the United Kingdom following the prescription of the group under counter-terror law by former Home Secretary Yvette Cooper last year. Now, that prescription was, of course, ruled unlawful in the High Court in February, though the ban is still in place while the government pursues an appeal. But there's no doubt that the arrest under the Terrorism Act of pensioners, vicars, NHS workers and ordinary people from every walk of life, now numbering over 3,000 in total, for a simple speech act has shocked many Britons to their core. And it turns out it's shocked some Americans too. Journalist and former Fox News presenter Tucker Carlson appeared on the Laura Kuenssberg show on Sunday. Kuenssberg is away, so Victoria Derbyshire conducted the interview instead. The topic was US President Donald Trump's war on Iran, and Derbyshire had a question about British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's role.
I want to ask you about the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, was criticised by the US President. He said, "This is not Winston Churchill we're dealing with." Do you think Keir Starmer has made the right calls in this war?
I don't think Keir Starmer makes any calls about anything. I mean, Keir Starmer's not.
Well, he did make a call about this.
Obviously. Right. Okay. No, Keir Starmer is every bit as enslaved as Donald Trump is. It is illegal. It is a crime for which you can be arrested in Britain right now criticizing Israel. If you say you're for Palestine action, you can be arrested. A lot of people have been arrested. So in other words, it is not legal in Britain to criticize another country.
That is not true. And in terms of this war, I'm specifically asking...
Wait, I'm sorry. What is not true about that? Have people not been arrested in Britain for criticizing Israel? They certainly have been. There's videotape of it.
If I may, Palestine Action is a proscribed group. It is banned. Therefore, people have been arrested.
Why is it banned?
That is correct.
Why is it banned?
I'm asking you a question specifically about Keir Starmer and the
decisions because the Israeli government wanted it banned. I often criticize Britain, but I love Britain. As I said, I have family there. And I don't think that Britons understand just how badly they've been shafted by the United States. And I am ashamed of that, and I hope that we will do everything we can to rectify it. I hope that our next president strikes a far more conciliatory and cooperative tone with Britain and tries to help Britain because it has a lot of problems that will be very obvious by the next time there's a presidential election in my country.
So, obviously she is technically correct that it's not the criticism of Israel that people get arrested for. The criticism of Israel, the opposition to the genocide, is just on the same sign as the ridiculously illegal phrase. But Carlson, at the end, is asking exactly the right question there. Why was Palestine Action banned? Of course, that is not a question the BBC has ever bothered to ask, despite a High Court ruling against the ban, giving them every possible reason to ask it. There's also every reason to at least ask questions about influence from Israel or Israeli firms. It's long been reported by independent media organizations like Declassified UK that Labour held secret meetings with Israeli firm Elbit, the target of Palestine Action actions, months before the prescription of the group. Declassified has also reported on how Elbit Systems lobbied the government to order a retrial after criminal charges against Palestine Action's co-founders were dismissed. A retrial was subsequently then ordered. And even The Guardian has reported on government briefing notes that activists say prove the last Conservative government tried to influence the police over Palestine Action protests while reassuring Elbit Systems. It's not like evidence of potential interference doesn't exist. I'm not even saying it is evidence of actual interference. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, but it's potential and it's been reported. And instead of pursuing that line, Derbyshire sort of gets into the technicalities of how ridiculous Carlson's claims are. She also then very quickly moved on to decidedly safer ground.
You have said that you have been called anti-Semitic because of your opposition to the US joining Israel in fighting this war.
Yes.
In March, senior Republican Senator Ted Cruz said anti-Semitism is being spread by loud voices, the most consequential of whom is Tucker Carlson. Republican Congressman Randy Fine called you the most dangerous anti-Semite in America. What do you say to that?
Of course I'm not an anti-Semite, and that's why they're calling me one. Because my position on Israel has nothing to do with the religion or ethnicity of Israelis. It has everything to do with decisions made by its government that hurt my country. And so in order to avoid having that debate, the fastest and most expedient way to end it is by calling the person trying to raise it a bigot. And I just don't think that works anymore. I would say that what matters in politics and in life is what you do. I think anti-Semitism and racism of all kinds, including anti-white racism, are all immoral and anti-Christian, and I oppose them. You shouldn't judge people on the basis of how they were born, period.
Carlson went on to talk about the changes he'd like to see in US political life, and that's where things got even more heated.
All American presidents since 1963 have done substantially what Israel wanted us to do, and now it's really hurting us. Right. And so the problem is not simply Trump. The problem is the mechanism of control that allows a country of 9 million to control a country of 350 million. What is that mechanism? I'm not sure I know the answer.
But
we need to find out what that is.
Well, as you know, as Commander-in-Chief, he could have said no to Benjamin Netanyahu. Nope. Other presidents have. Joe Biden, Barack Obama.
You're absolutely right. And I made that point. And you're absolutely right, they did. And I wish our president had. But he didn't.
So it's not the system.
And he went into a war. Well, it is the system, because the last president financed the Gaza genocide. The president before him, same thing.
Now, you probably remember that last week there was a very bizarre, last-minute, unannounced press conference by Melania Trump. Carlson was asked about what he thought that press conference was all about.
I wanted to ask you about the Melania Trump press conference, very unusual, where she denied connections to Jeffrey Epstein and said that any claims linking her and him need to end today. What do you think is going on there?
Strictly speaking, I don't know what's going on there. I know the White House communication staff had no idea she was going to say that. So it's one of two possibilities. Either she was reading speculation about her relationship with Epstein on the internet and she was upset and wanted to clear her name, which is totally possible. Or there was something else going on. So the Israeli government has a long and well-documented track record of using sex scandal or the appearance of scandal to force American political leaders into doing its bidding. You hope it wasn't that. But I did notice that within an hour or two after that press conference, a piece came out, I think, in the Daily Beast alleging some connection between Melania Trump and Epstein, which was obviously hurtful to her and embarrassing to the first family. So I don't know if there's any kind of connection, but I do know, once again, this is a fact that sex scandals are used, probably not just by the Israeli government, probably lots of foreign governments. It's not just the Israelis. I just want to be clear.
I mean, I am going to point out, I probably don't need to because our audience can see and hear for themselves. Pretty much everything that you've said in our conversation, Tucker Carlson, you have put at the door of the Israeli government. Now, to some people, that will be evidence that you are anti-Semitic. You are anti-Jewish.
Oh, I know. I'm very anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish. Well, first of all, the state of Israel does not speak for all Jews at all, despite its claims. It does not. There are many, many Jews, many of whom I know, who don't think the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu speaks for them.
No.
I'm speaking of the government, not religion.
Hold on. Because I wasn't suggesting that.
Of course you were suggesting
what
that.
I was suggesting was that a lot of the
I've been in
things
this
that you
business
discussed
longer
today,
than you, and I understand what a slur looks like. And you're attempting to call me an anti-Semite in a passive-aggressive way. Some people would say that. Well, I'm responding to your slur and saying that it's untrue. It does not apply to me. Doubtless there are anti-Semites who don't like Israel. I'm not an anti-Semite. I don't hate Israel. The Israeli government, this is documented, and I saw it personally, steered the United States into a war that hurts the United States and the world. I'm offended by that. I didn't want it, and I'm mad about it now. I have every right to feel that way. That does not make me an anti-Semite, despite your insinuation. And I think it's important that I say that. And by the way, I hope that you run this. I can't control whether or not you air this exchange. I hope that you will, because I think it's important to push back against slurs like that, because they limit our ability to understand what's actually happening. This is not an attack by Jews on the United States. This is Benjamin Netanyahu moving the United States to do something he thinks will benefit him, but that does not benefit us. It's that simple.
Barry, I found this sort of like a really complicated interview. You know, I'm someone, you know, not everybody agrees with me, even amongst people I work with, but I'm someone who holds Tucker Carlson in deep suspicion. You know, he campaigned for Trump. While he was close to Trump, he supported him endlessly. At some point, he stopped. And, you know, my own view is that, you know, he's really aware of like the MAGA base, and he's trying to shore up either himself or somebody else to sort of take that on. But what did you think of the conversation with Derbyshire there about the idea of Israeli interference in the American government, or in some of our own practices, like, for example, you know, as I put in the piece, of you know, three reports on at least lobbying by Israeli officials or Israeli businesses in respect of like the law in the UK. What did you make of that back and forth between them?
I don't know whether Tucker Carlson is on a grift. I don't know what his ambition might be with this sort of almost change of heart he's had, but boy, he is an effective orator when it comes to this stuff. Whether it's Israel's genocide on Gaza, whether it's the US-Israeli war in Iran, he is out there making mincemeat of mainstream media. And I think, you know, that he's partly able to do that because he came up through the mainstream media, and it's excellent to watch, whatever his motivation may be. And I think that we just saw it again there. I actually have quite a lot of respect for Victoria Derbyshire. I think she's by far the best interviewer that BBC has. And I think that when she stands in for Laura Kuenssberg, you usually get a better show with the rigor of the interview applied more evenly to people across the left and the right. And initially when I was watching that interview, I thought, well, I don't see what's so controversial about it. You know, she's asking him some tough questions. That's her job. You know, she's putting the anti-Semitism thing to him. That's her job. I don't think we played the clip, but there was a bit where she asked him about platforming Nick Fuentes on the show also, and said, you know, well, Nick Fuentes is an anti-Semite, to which Carlson said, yes, he is. And I disagree with him. what I found egregious was the fact that every time Carlson mentioned Israel as being culpable in some way. So yes, whether that was that Israel has at least influenced the UK government to prescribe Palestine action, which, as you pointed out, is well documented. And even if that is just the Israeli lobby, that's Israeli interference. That's Israeli influence. That's Israel pushing the government to do something. The Israeli lobby, at the very least, indicates that that's a fact. That's what that is. And then when he talked about, Trump being influenced by Israel to go to war with Iran, again, that's incontrovertible fact. What Victoria Derbyshire said was, well, Biden didn't go into war, Obama didn't go into the Iran war. And, Tucker said, sure, of course, they have some agency, right? Trump could have chosen not to. But if Israel didn't want him to go to war with Iran, the US would not be at war with Iran right now. So I don't think Tucker Carlson was saying anything that wasn't factual and verifiable. But what I noticed about Victoria Derbyshire through the interview was, whenever Tucker Carlson pointed the finger at Israel, there was a palpable disdain on Victoria Derbyshire's face. Now, again, I respect her as an interviewer, but to me, it was very apparent. She would sigh. She would try to move on. She would say, okay, there was just this disdain, which she seemed to be communicating that she did in fact think that he was an anti-Semite. And it looked to me like the entire interview, she was conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, that old chestnut. And I was convinced about when she brought it back at the end and said, in a kind of impatient way, you've spent this entire interview accusing Israel of A, B, and C. So many people will say you're an anti-Semite. I agree with him. I think it was a slur. And I think that for a BBC interviewer who I actually do have respect for, she fell right back into what we've seen for the last 2.5 years, which is the BBC pushing the Israeli line, pushing the British government line, being unable to step back and think about these things in a different way. That's one of the things I find so compelling about him in these interviews, similarly to one he did with The Economist editor a couple of weeks ago. He challenges the framing, and they almost don't know what to do with it. So I think Victoria Derbyshire did herself a disservice there, and I do think it was pretty outrageous to raise anti-Semitism 3 to 4 times.
What was crazy about it is that the interview was all about Iran, right? It moved on to Nick Fuentes at one point when Carlson countered the anti-Semitism point around his criticism of Israel, when she brought up Ted Cruz and his comments and whatever. But it was essentially an interview about geopolitics and about the war in Iran, in which Israel is the partner. Junior partner, senior partner, who knows, but is the partner. And of course, in that situation where, as Carlson points out constantly during that interview, America is now in a war, which is bad for America. And it's not unreasonable to ask a question about how it got into that situation and whether Israel was a part of the decision-making, bad or good, that got it into that situation. And I've referenced it a few times already on this show, but this New York Times piece about the build-up to the war, the decision-making behind it, there's one point where Netanyahu comes in and gives his pitch about what he wants America to do. Trump says thumbs up, and then they do an intelligence assessment, and the intelligence people come back the next day and they say something, or his general says something like, the thing about the Israelis is that they always overpromise and underdeliver, something like that. Now, like when I read that, I didn't think for a minute that was an anti-Semitic comment. I just thought that was like a military evaluation, a political strategic evaluation of Israel as a partner in these kinds of adventures. But when Carlson brings up the question of influence which is in fact laid out there in a New York Times article, it's suddenly at that point anti-Semitic. I mean, I can see the stuff about, platforming people like Nick Fuentes. Like personally, I wouldn't do it. I don't really want to hear from him. But, he did do it, and he called him an anti-Semite, and Teddy disagreed with his views.
I think it's a fair question. It's a fair question to say, explain platforming Nick Fuentes. She asked it, he explained it. But the thing is, he wasn't talking about dark forces behind the scenes, manipulating every aspect of US government policy. he was talking primarily about actual documented influence. You know, whether that was talking about the war in Iran or talking about what happened here, we have reporting, we have verifiable facts about the influence. You know, like I say, he wasn't talking about conspiracy theories. He was talking about actual things that have happened that we know happened. So for Victoria Derbyshire's response to that to be, well, many people are going to think you're anti-Semitic, is bizarre.
Yeah.
We're talking about verifiable facts.
Yeah. Another thing that, just to end on this, I found really striking is after that interview, Victoria Derbyshire goes back to the panel of, you know, talking heads that she's got there for that day. And the question of Tucker Carlson on Palestine Action comes up, and Mary Beard, you know, the Cambridge classicist who is one of the panelists, she says, oh, well, you know, he did get really confused about Palestine Action, didn't he? And, you know, so he doesn't know everything. And I was just thinking, he's not that confused, because he's asked this question, as I said in the piece, that is based on, you know, is why did the UK ban it? Why did the UK ban it? Because Israel wanted it to. He asks this question, he makes this point, which is just not even considered by the people who are invited onto the BBC to talk about this interview. They're not, you know, they don't engage with the interview. Like personally, I would never have an interview on this show where I then talk about the interview with somebody else and the person's not there to answer for themselves. It's very strange, but they did that on Kunzberg. But yeah, it's just, you know, something sort of the level of education. I know she's a Cambridge classicist, and I don't want to single her out because no one on the panel brought this up, but the level of a certain kind of political education of the people who are brought on and allowed to speak on the BBC seems to me strikingly low, because they don't, you know, I think the information they get is all through these kind of mainstream sources, and they haven't seen things like the declassified reporting or the reporting that we've done at Novara Media, or even, you know, reporting that's been done in The Guardian in one
And so
case.
they think it's weird when he challenges framing.
Yeah, exactly.
They cannot understand that framing, that is the way that the media that they consume frames everything. When it's challenged, they find that weird. I know we're finishing, but what about when they went back to the panel? Alex Younger, I think was his name, the former chief of MI6, I thought was very frank when he said he agreed with Tucker Carlson. And then he said that Donald Trump was turning into a more traditional president in some ways. Erratic but traditional, in that he was getting involved in the Middle East, cozying up to Netanyahu and doing war. Which I just thought was amazing from this like former head of MI6, this real frank sort of moment that I guess told us what he thought of the Americans when he was heading up bloody the British intelligence service. So really interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, well, Barry, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thank you,
it's been
Stephen.
Great to see you.
See you soon.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.